Our session today is stress management and resilience building. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a conversation with you. I'm going to explain, give you context. Where are we at the moment? What's happening? Why we're in the situation? And give you some recommendations on what to do. Okay. Hope you enjoyed the trip. Can you hear me okay? Right. Please, I'd ask if you could just observe the monitor. I'm going to be reading along with you. As business executives, we are progressively dealing with a workforce that's becoming functionally unemployable as a result of stress and stress-related issues and problems. This impacts directly on our bottom line through productivity. And if productivity down, profits down. Folks, can I just ask, how many are HR out in the audience, HR specific? Just by show of hands. Okay, so the majority. Can I ask, is anybody from the director level? Are we all managers? Okay, we're at the management level. Okay, that's super. Just, I need to gear my talk to make sure that I'm giving the right examples. And I think we had this conversation about impacting on the bottom line. Your accountability lies in the productivity level. If you had been the chief HR officer, I would be talking about profits. It's one and the same thing, whether you're talking productivity or profits, same thing. So over the next 45 minutes, I'm going to introduce you to some tools which we believe take a dysfunctional workforce and turn them into a thriving, productive team. Let's start 3 years ago. In 2016, the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, published a book called The Fourth Industrial Revolution. In it, he outlined the unprecedented changes that are occurring politically, socially, economically, as a result of technological changes. Now, what was so important about this publication to us is it gave us a lens and a narrative to understand what was happening to us. We all experienced it, and we are experiencing it. But we didn't have a language or a way to talk about it. And what was so special about his book, it gave us context in which we could understand not only what's happening now, but what we're heading towards. The key industrial shift that Schwab described was that we were shifting away from these independent technologies. SAP, Oracle, PeopleSoft, ERPs, Microsoft, things that had towers on their own, units on their own. A fridge was still a fridge. And finally, they've become included in a fully entangled, symbiotic, worldwide smart grid. Now, for many of us, it is almost inconceivable for us to try and understand the technological changes. But the capacity of the smart grid, based on its integration, has been able to facilitate unprecedented technological breakthroughs with opportunistic and disruptive implications in business. Something, as a person who sits at the board level, but also is highly operational, when I go to these technical talks and I hear the developers talking about so excitedly, it's not disruptive, it's got to be disruptive. And I think, do you understand what you're saying when you say disruptive? You are saying that you are structurally altering the very fabric of how things are done. Do you know what the implications of that are? I'm not saying it's wrong, but you probably would not embrace it as enthusiastically if you knew what the human costs were going to be to your disruptive technology. Have you guys experienced that as HR practitioners? That when they have this disruption, it's massive, it's huge, and the human cost is incredible. But let me list some of these things. We've got artificial intelligence, augmented reality, blockchain, drones, the Internet of Things, robotics, virtual reality, gene sequencing, nanotechnology, renewable energies, quantum computing, 3D printing. Now, any one of these, had they occurred 10 or 15 years ago, would have been absolutely incredibly mind-blowing in their own right. I'm rattling off a list here, a list of pieces of technology that are going to change the very foundation of how we do and think and define ourselves as human beings. And look, I'm just rattling them off. What, maybe 3? No. We're still going. Autonomous vehicles, smart materials that are self-healing, self-cleaning, metals with memories that revert to original shapes, which incidentally, how many of you have kids or yourselves with braces? You're already using that metal that reverts to the original shape. That's what the braces today for teeth are based on. Now, the structural transformations that are brought about by these rapidly developing technologies have made work a moving target. It's a constant series of changes, modification, upgrades, amendments, new acquisitions to the production process. How many of you have just finished one implementation and you're told, well, now you have to start with another? Okay, it's just endless. A series of endless changes where you just feel that you can't catch up. It has fundamentally altered the scope of skills that are required for people to successfully navigate and deliver in the workplace. So the technological changes, when I say that they structurally change, we have to become different human beings if we are going to thrive and cope over the next years, not 10 years hence, tomorrow, the next day. We have to alter the way we actually think and behave and act as human beings. There's been a shift away from hard skills, which are required to do the job, obviously, but to redefining and reprioritizing soft skills, which relate to personal attributes. Now, most of us have heard about soft skills. Most of us in the industry have always realized that soft skills are important, but they've never been on any kind of serious business agenda until now. Excuse me. In 2015, we were so excited. Suddenly there was a serious list of soft skills that we could all relate to. They were taking soft skills seriously. And boy, complex problem solving, coordinate with others, people management, critical thinking, negotiation, quality control, service orientation, judgment and decision making, active listening, creativity. This finally was a recognition of the need of soft skills, that the person made a difference, that you could have a whole lot of different engineers, but some engineers would be better than others based on their personal attributes. And this was given recognition. Well, no sooner did this list came out than it became defunct, and we already have a list for 2020. Resilience is the top criteria, and it is becoming paramount in terms of the soft skills. Cognitive flexibility, the sophistication of this list when you see now is from boardroom to backroom. This is not just your managers, this is not just your executives, this is your PA, this is your miners, this is every single person who has some kind of a footprint in the workplace, the list that I'm giving you now. Look at the number of thinking jobs, intuitive thinking, creative thinking, critical thinking, for everybody. Complex problem solving, not just problem solving, complex problem solving, not just decision making, but decisive decision making, being able to make rapid, realistic, responsible decisions immediately in the moment. Leadership and fellowship. Fellowship has become the alter ego to leadership. You don't lead unless you have a fellowship, otherwise you're a manager. Leadership is a verb, not a noun. You can't assign yourself and say, I'm a leader. You're a leader because you have followers. And followers come with a price. You have to have a certain type of a personality type and attributes, which we'll go through. Service orientation, flexibility and adaptability in different roles. You can start off as the HR director on Monday, but by Friday you're in Dubai teaching a series of technological pieces of software. Exactly, there we go, nods. You don't know the software, you don't know how to train, and yet you have to be able to deliver on the job. That adaptability, you start off with the PA, and suddenly you're standing in for the general manager. This flexibility is blurring roles, blurring responsibilities, blurring who and what you are in the actual business place. Work in a cohesive, synchronized, and collaborative way within and between teams. No longer is it just the project group that have come together. Now the teams are like synchronistic swimmers. They have to work cohesively, just the same way as the military, the SEALs do, the way that in an emergency center they do, in these crisis orientations where they work with absolute synchronized communication, efficacy of output, etc. That's what's beginning to happen in the workplace. We can't function without that in the for our environment. Process and interpret unstructured information. This is probably the most stressful. We already have it. All the data that comes at us from internet, SMS, WhatsApp groups, etc., is unstructured. We have to give it context and give it meaning. And we're going to get more. Unstructured information, technology is being specifically designed to push more unstructured information at us, not structured. And then finally, this commitment to excellence, which is raising its head. Now, commitment to excellence has kind of always been around there, and it's up to that individual company, etc. However, this is not a demand on the part of the clients. This is the demand on the part of the smart grid. If what you're doing is not compatible and of the standard of excellence of the smart grid, you're disruptive, you're out. And by the very definition that that technology is demanding that excellence, it has a beautiful effect in other areas of service. If you expect that from your technology, you're going to expect it from other areas, whether or not in actual fact it's part of the smart grid. So this commitment to excellence is critical and is going to be a defining factor. You can be sailing along today and you'll be out of the game in 24 hours. Resilience is the number one soft skill required for the 4IR business environment. It's defined as the mental and emotional ability to cope with a crisis and then return to a pre-crisis status very, very quickly. A resilient person is seen to use mental processes and behaviors to develop personal skills and abilities to both survive and thrive with and without stress. It's really important to understand, folks, that being resilient is not just being in the battlefield. It's not just for a war zone. You have to be resilient to be happy as well. Happy, in actual fact, as you'll see later, are critical executive feelings and emotions that you need to have to be able to push yourself forward in tough situations. Not dangerous situations, just tough situations. Studies of resilient people have shown several common characteristics that appear to underpin their ability to develop these coping skills. These coping skills exist in people right now. This is not some alien set of skills that we've drawn down. These are skills that are going to be first and foremost critical in yourselves to make sure that you individually, as you sit here, are functionally employable in the next couple of years. So this is definitely inward looking, but most of all in terms of your teams, your accountability to make sure that your teams are productive. You have to make sure that they have these skills. They are non-negotiable, folks, and this is just the first pass of research that has been done. There's new research that is coming that is doubling up on the type of characteristics that they're finding in resilient people. So let's start. Let's have a little look. Emotional intelligence. Resilient people are not susceptible to emotional triggers. They have the capacity to regulate their thoughts and emotions and handle interpersonal relationships judiciously and empathetically. In the business context, managers who are calm, instead of impulsive, anxious, or prone to anger, are more likely to inspire trust and loyalty because people know where they stand with them. Your experience, your managers are far calmer. People tend to follow them and be led with them a lot easier, calm and rational. Resilient individuals are able to calmly and rationally look at a problem, engage a successful solution. They tend to prompt the same calm rationality in people around them. You just have to walk past a project group. If they are proactive, they engage, they're talking, you know you have a resilient leader or you have resilient people within that project plan. You can immediately see the effect. In the business context, employees function more effectively when they trust the thinking and decision-making skills of their managers. This trust in turn allows them to act more decisively on the decisions by that manager. If they're vacillating, if they're doubting and not too sure if this person is capable or competent, or the person's been angry, is the person being reactive, they're not too sure. What are the consequences if they, in actual fact, act on those decisions? So there's that hesitancy, which we can't afford, we can't have. Control. Resilient people have an internal locus of control. They see themselves as having control over their lives. They don't blame outside sources for failures or problems. Even if it is something that is external to themselves, they don't look to that as a source of blame. This encourages accountability in themselves and in teams. It's terribly important. Growth and development. Resilient people self-manage their skill acquisition process and embrace feedback that advances their professional and personal growth. Something that is key to resilient people is it doesn't matter what they are told. They never take it personally. So if somebody's being critical or personal, they never sweat the small things. They don't take it personally. They extract out of it what is important and they move on. In the business context, resilient people tend to be at the center of self-driven growth hubs in which people are motivated and inspired to do better and self-manage their own skill acquisition. This is key in the 4IR environment, which requires that people rapidly and relentlessly upskill themselves while still being commercially productive. Folks, this is really an important component because, as you know, taking people outside of a work environment to go do training, this is becoming less and less. People simply can't. You'll send them on training, but there's presenteeism. They're there, but they're not really acquiring the skills. The whole area of skill acquisition, knowledge acquisition is changing. It's becoming through role modeling, being with people that are resilient, etc. learning from them. It's an osmotic process rather than the traditional learning process. Authentic. Resilient people are consistently themselves in all situations, good or bad, and with all people, irrespective of social or professional rank. In business, this genuineness engenders confidence and trust in a person, which is critical for teamwork and reduces concerns of changeability and unpredictability. Interpersonal relations. Resilient people view and accept others without judgment or jealousy. They are not dependent on and motivated by social or cultural forces. They are genuinely interested in other people, which gives them greater insight into what motivates and drives people. In the business context, people feel understood and accepted by resilient people and spend less time worrying about possible judgment and or rejection. Motivate and inspire. Now, folks, this is a key difference. In the past, it was about motivating. It was external to yourself. Go and motivate your teams, inspire your teams. Research has shown us it doesn't work like that. Resilient people motivate and inspire themselves into action, irrespective of the reason for the action, good or bad. Because their motivation is drawn from an internal source, they're able to sustain that motivation and inspiration for long, sometimes indefinite periods of time. This is key for the 4IR environment. But what is more important, this in turn motivates and inspires the people around them, not in short bursts, as with motivational speakers, but for sustained periods. For those of you that are currently involved with stressed staff, I think you can see that this is absolutely critical, and we'll have a look when we're looking at power chemicals around the body. This becomes terribly important for motivation and inspiration. Resilient people tend to encourage the development of motivational skills in others by their own example, which again is critical in the 4IR environment. This speaks again to what I was saying earlier, where the traditional training doesn't work. We don't have the time, and because people are not present in the moment, it's not really having the learning curve that we need. So people are learning by example. You just have to put people for 1 week with a resilient person, and you will automatically see a change, a motivation, and inspiration on the part of the people. Again, as I say, it's almost an osmotic process where people absorb the qualities of that individual. Once they've got the qualities, they can acquire the skills. Grudges. Resilient people don't hold grudges. They have reduced ego boundaries and are far more focused on problems outside themselves as opposed to personal egocentric problems. In the volatile and disruptive 4IR environment, where the chances of offending somebody is extremely high. So this is a key prerequisite for successful teams. You just have to look at your teams at the moment. There's probably an enormous amount of interpersonal angst, difficulties, etc. You know, he did this, she did this, finger pointing, blame, etc. I can see all of you are so tired. This is definitely the graveyard shift. Just keep listening, folks. Be resilient. Okay, so this holding of grudges, being able to move on, to not sweat the small things is a really important part of the profile of an individual. Reliability. Resilient people take their commitments seriously and are regarded as reliable and trustworthy. This is really key, folks, because in the business context, particularly in disruptive and unpredictable situations, people need to be trusted to execute tasks timely and efficiently with no supervision. Things are changing so fast that we have junior staff members having to make executive calls and judgments because there's nobody else around, and it has to be done there and then, and that's now. And that is happening more and more. When you build a resilient staff overall, that doesn't mean to say that people are going to come along and make strategic, stupid decisions and make decisions that are outside of their knowledge base. What they're going to do is take on the responsibility to understand the risk that if something is not done there and then, there's going to be a consequence. So they're not necessarily going to fly the airplane, but they know they need to go and wake up the other pilot, otherwise the ship is going to, or the plane is going to crash. Okay, so this allowing and facilitating all people to become decision makers is quite a difficult process, but when you've built up that resilience, you see a shift in the way that they engage with themselves and others. Survivor mentality. Resilient people see themselves as survivors, not victims. No matter what the crisis, resilient people avoid thinking like a victim and instead look for ways to resolve the problem. They move on. They don't sit there worrying about why, when. They accept the facts as they are. What is the solution? And this is crucial in the 4IR environment where workplace pressures can cause crippling anxiety, which directly impact productivity and thus profits. Don't procrastinate. Resilient people don't put off tasks and are able to effectively prioritize and execute tasks. When you are procrastinating, it's not because you are, sort of not getting things. Procrastination comes from the inability to make a decision. Keep putting it off. They don't get anxious or overwhelmed by responsibilities and are able to determine realistic deadlines. They don't overpromise and don't underdeliver. Again, this is critical because in the rapid response time and integrated work schedules of the 4IR workplace, it doesn't allow for procrastination. When I spoke about teams, I said not only within but between teams. As we're delivering, it's becoming less and less that it's one individual that is delivering and less that it's one team delivering. It's suddenly several teams that are running the same race and have to meet and end at the same area and space of delivery. See opportunities and adversities. Resilient people always make lemonade out of lemons. They intuitively seek opportunities in adverse situations. This is a key trait as it helps prevent the onset of anxiety in teams. When you have teams where people know that it might not be the project leader, it may, but where they just know they've got groups of people who in actual fact are solution orientated. They feel that there is going to be something that they can do. They're not crippled with anxiety because there's going to be a problem or a crisis or non-delivery. So having spoken about this, so let's just sort of sum up what we've done so far. We've spoken about the 4IR, the Fourth Industrial Revolution. You've all, Fourth Industrial Revolution, raise hands? You've all heard about it. It's kind of the buzzword. Yeah, you're probably sick to death of it, hey, but too much. I did a talk the other day, and she said, we're so been there, done, I bought the T-shirt. I thought, boy, I don't know where you're coming from because this T-shirt ain't getting old, my friend. It's around for a long time. But yes, we are familiar with the word, but it's not a trend. It's a very serious event that is happening out there in the economy. And it's taking us into spaces that we as humans have never been before. And where's the HR component? We have to be there. We have to understand. So understand the 4IR is critical. You've got to up your skills in terms of your technological knowledge and understanding. Likewise, we said in order to cope with that, we have to have a particular type of new employee and new worker to be able to cope with it. That person has to be resilient. And now comes the humdinger, is that for most of us, far from that wonderful sort of alien type individual that has all those wonderful skills, we're sitting there with fraught with anxiety. Our staff, far from being resilient. So within the first decade of this 21st century, stress management shot to the top of the business agenda with unsustainable levels of absenteeism, presenteeism. If all of us could walk away from this and say, oh, for goodness sake, let's just get rid of all these stressed people, there's a lot of us that probably would take that option because we ourselves are stressed. But we don't. Absenteeism, presenteeism is the bottom line. It's the measure by which our job is successful or not successful. We can't avoid it. We have to find some way of sorting this out. And businesses, especially at the board and executive level, and this is where time is on your side. You guys probably were far more proactive. A decade ago, in the 90s, you probably recognized these issues beginning to be raised. You probably spoke, trying to get the funds, etc. But today, let me tell you, at the executive layer, your C-suite, they're paying attention because it's hitting the bottom line. Productivity is going down, profits are going down. So they definitely on your side and would be far more receptive to ideas on how to deal with stress. So they realize that it's killing their profits. For the first time in history, business markets and economies have a financial as opposed to social vested interest in mental health. In this year, January of this year, the World Economic Forum estimated that 275 million people suffer from anxiety disorders. That's about 4% of the global population, with a spread of between 2.5 and 6.5 of the population per country. However, these figures are seen as gross underestimations due to a lack of effective reporting and effective diagnoses. The latest figures that are coming out is 75% of the world population. To go from 4% to 75% is a huge leap. It's massive. It's quite unbelievable. Folks? The World Economic Forum predicts that by 2030, the cost of the global economy of all mental health problems could amount to 16 trillion. And that figure is rising as they build in other cost factors that they didn't anticipate. To grapple with contemporary stress, there's been a paradigm shift. We've moved from this sort of mechanistic perception of people where organizations are a series of cogs and wheels, to a more organic view, which identifies production as being derived as the output of living matter. Now, don't you just love that? The output of living matter, not humans. I thought of changing that word to humans, but when you Google it, it actually just says living matter. You're living matter. Your staff is living matter. Very interesting way of defining your staff. But having had this conceptual leap, it's really important because this conceptual model allows for far greater efficacy in predictive and anticipatory modeling in the 4IR environment. We need to know how to anticipate, and the mechanistic model didn't help us. It would never have helped us in terms of stress management. Because an example of the organic view in use is our reaching out to neuroscience to understand and manage the stress response. You couldn't have done that with a mechanistic view. Now, neuroscience in the past decade has steadily exposed the biological underpinnings of the brain that lead to the stress response. For the first time, business and the general public are able to access information that provide insight on how neurons in the nervous system engage to modulate behavior between alert and rest states, which is stress and non-stress states, the speed at which this is achieved, and the consequences and implications of sustained stress. This knowledge of the cause and effect of stress, as well as the consequence of non-management, has allowed for proactive, commercially viable interventions to take place. Neuroscience. Let's step into the world of neuroscience. The C-suite of the stress response: hippocampus, thalamus, hypothalamus, amygdala, prefrontal cortex. Okay, so fundamentally in the stress response, we have 5 parts of the brain that we have to be concerned about. We're not neuroscientists, so let me put a couple of avatars there, and let's take the brain out of the way, and let's just find out what these guys do. So let's have a little look. The amygdala is the starting point. It's the fear center. Think of it as your security checkpoint. As you come into a building, you're going to have somebody assessing you. So they receive this incoming sensory data, they evaluate and assess it for danger, and if they see danger, immediately they ring the bell, send the danger signal to the hypothalamus, which is the logistic function. Think of it as your dispatch center, and immediately it triggers the release of your stress hormones. That's it. Very few clicks. Okay, that's how the brain works under a nanosecond. And you'll have your first is adrenaline, and a few minutes later it'll be followed by cortisol. That's it. That's how the brain works in terms of stress. So we've done our security checkpoint. The information then goes to the thalamus, which is the relay center. But think of it as the post office. So the post office receives all the sensory data, it sorts it all out, and it sends it to the various parts of the brain. This includes the hippocampus, which is the storage and retrieval. But again, think of it as the library. So the sensory data is linked to an associated emotion, and then it's sent off to the various parts of the brain. But folks, for us in business, the part that I have found that people have such enormous difficulty with is realizing that we have to have this emotional component associated with thoughts. It's the language of the body. It is the emotion that releases and triggers the chemical response. It's not the thought. And we'll hear more about this as we go on. So once you've had the the sensory data has come in, it's linked to the emotion. It's then stored at the various centers of the brain and recalled as memory. So, and it's stored as a fragmented memory, not as a collective memory, which helps when we recall, we can actually change the way that we remember what's happened. The prefrontal cortex, it is the executive functioning, the thinking and planning center, receives the incoming data, impulse control. It uses it for impulse control, self-monitoring, complex planning, perceiving consequences of one's actions, anticipating events in the environment, and planning for the future. That prefrontal cortex, this part of your brain over here, is absolutely critical. That's your mammalian brain, and helps us achieve and be what we are in our business context. So let's get a case study. That's how the brain functions. That's the C-suite, those are their jobs, but let's look at a case study. So the line arrives, immediately the amygdala does its job, it notifies the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus releases the stress hormones. The sympathetic nervous system kicks in, gears for flight or fight, your breath quickens, it distributes the oxygen-rich blood to the body. Blood vessels constrict in the outer area, divert oxygen to the muscles. Higher order functioning stops, shifts to a more reactive mode. That means everything here, the prefrontal cortex, shuts down. You are no longer thinking when the lion is chasing you. You are reacting. Digestion stops, immune functioning stops. Now, after a while, The lion sits around. At some point, you and the tree and the lion can go away because it's not going to eat you that day. And the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in, is gearing for rest and digest. The breath goes back to normal, the blood vessels dilate, high order functioning re-engages, digestion restarts, the immune functioning restarts, and the stress reaction stops. Now, part of the problem, folks, is that it's not only those external stimuli that cause the stress response. As you as humans have probably realized, is in actual fact, thought alone can result. And folks, the color, I'm not exactly sure why the little cloud there that represents thoughts is not coming out. It did in the previous session. We'll check later because I do the same presentation tomorrow. If any of you want to see that, it'll be available tomorrow at 2 o'clock. But for the moment, there's a little cloud there that represents thoughts. It is internal thoughts that can trigger exactly the same response on the hypothalamus. So, for example, let's take your bond repayments. The amygdala responds to those bond repayments in exactly the same way and releases exactly the same hormones. Now, the problem with us is unlike the lion, where we can define that is a lion, we can see it, it's present, and now the lion has walked away. The amygdala can't assess the risk factor of the bond repayments with the same level of certainty. Is it a risk? It is not a risk. Am I going to have my job tomorrow? Am I not going to have my job tomorrow? So there is always this ambiguity around contemporary internal thoughts. So it becomes obsessive, repetitive, invasive thoughts. They go on continuously worrying about it. And for many people, it goes on day after day, month after month, year after year. And what we have found is that it's the amygdala. When it's left unchecked, it processes information relentlessly, checking and rechecking for risks. Now, it's engaged with the hippocampus, our library, and is constantly sourcing those internal thoughts, is constantly pulling them back. I was so busy worrying about the bond repayments, but then I went to work and I had to worry about this. Now I'm at home, so I can worry about that bond repayment again. So we're constantly shuffling between, for example, the bad boss. Does the boss like me, not like me? What is the boss doing? The bad client. The client, I'm going to lose that client. The bad colleagues, they don't like me. I'm going to be off that project. They're orchestrating me being out of the team, not working enough hours, deadlines. And this is repetitive. Now imagine, out there in the field, you maybe have had a couple of lions that you had to worry about. Today, we have hundreds of lions, internal lions, obscure lions that we're processing and dealing with and imagining and worrying about all the time in the contemporary society. What happens is our mammalian brain, our thinking brain, shuts down. The reptilian brain, the activity here, the reactive brain, that's where the greater activity begins to happen. The loss of the thinking and the planning center, the impulse control, self-monitoring, complex planning, perceived consequences of one's actions, anticipating events in the environment, planning for the future, all of that is gone, stops. Instead, what we have, what these people become, and what you probably recognize in your colleagues and or possibly yourself, is we become suspicious, aggressive, verbally and in some cases physically abusive, defensive, knee-jerk reaction, poor decisions, poor planning, low impulse control, inability to see the consequences of behavior. And for some people, they can hold a veneer of what looks like I'm in control, but scratch, and underlying that is all of these behaviors, all of these characteristics, and I can see nods. Either yourselves, your spouses, your colleagues, your bosses, you're all feeling it. Everybody's in their reptilian brain at the moment. And this is the language that you're going to be speaking. It's not going to be about blaming the person. It's about, for us, from an HR point of view, is understanding what is happening to that person from a neurological point of view. It is a waste of time to look at the individual, absolute waste of time. You have to begin to look at them as living matter, organic matter. For that person, they're experiencing it as chronic fatigue, decision fatigue, and in most cases, decision avoidance, burnout, blunted emotions, disengagement, over-engagement, where somebody is obsessing about work. They can't stop thinking. They're waking up 3 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, I can see nods. You're probably referring to yourselves now, hey? Working on the weekends, working at night, 10 o'clock, suddenly waking up and putting together a PowerPoint presentation. Absenteeism begins to become manifest, and presenteeism. I mean, this presenteeism is actually amazing because that's probably the biggest killer of profits at the moment. People are there, but they're simply not engaged. And the worst thing is they speak as if they're engaged. They talk. It's very difficult to assess whether it's presenteeism or not. But when you begin to look at the output, that's when the measure comes in. Now, from a business point of view, folks, you might have one or two people who are stressed, but depending on what position that person holds and or what the stress is, you can instantly contaminate the entire organization if you have a bad boss. In terms of situations, if that trigger relates to everybody else, the first person that walks out of the HR department with that retrenchment note in their hand, instantly you've got a high-stressed organization throughout. So it's situational as well. Now, before, I hate to tell you, but HR people could simply go out and get fresh stock. They'd go externally and they would go on a recruitment drive and they would bring in people. I can see the nods there. Oops, yes, that's what we used to do. Well, I'm afraid that doesn't work today because everybody is stressed. The stresses are not related to work alone. The stresses are external to work. They are a lot more and relate very much to the information we're processing, which is another presentation. So it's external to ourselves. So there's no new stock that you can come in. People within your organization are stressed and people external to your organization are stressed. So you have to do something about stress. Your productivity is down, your profit is down. Folks, when economies go into a recession, it's as a result of this. Recession does not happen because there's some kind of magical economy dust that is spread out over the land. Recessions are based on human stress. That's what research is showing. It's incredible what economists are finding at the moment. They can go back and see every single recessional situation, even down to droughts, etc. It's down to the way that people behave. So what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? Stress management. What is the solution, folks? So, the first thing is, stress is costing us money. Bottom line. And if you're not directly in the CFO's offices, if you're not in the finance offices, where they're stressing about the cost of stress, it's trickling back to you because they're shouting because, why is there no productivity, etc. So stress costs us money. Bottom line, it costs you your reputation because you are not able to engage with the staff and make them productive. It must be dealt with. The solution it must work and it must be cost effective. Those are the criteria for stress management. Now, folks, obviously what we need to do, and the traditional form of it is identify, monitor, manage the potential stress triggers, so we need to be able to do it as we have traditionally. The difference is, in the past, there was a tendency on the part of the HR department and managers in general saying, oh, well, I did this, the staff didn't, react. They're stupid staff or stupid individuals. That's the basic way. If you peeled away the onion, that's how people reacted. And there was kind of this illusion that something was done. You didn't really have to you had to act out that you were doing it, but there was no cost if it didn't work. Today, there's a cost. If it doesn't work, if you don't do the right thing, your ship sinks. Boom, bottom line. And your reputation along with it. Did you successfully navigate through the 4IR? No, I didn't. You're not going to be employed as an HR manager. You'll have to change your job. The accountability and responsibility in terms of getting people to be productive is absolutely critical. When you define yourself in the space of people management, you have to know and understand how the brain works, because that's the alpha and omega of understanding how to relate to the stress and how to manage those triggers. Because the traditional triggers that you think are out there are not the triggers that are here today. And it's not as simple as saying, oh my goodness, I'm going to get rid of a bad manager. Because sometimes a little bit of stress works, but you've got to know exactly how much stress is going to work neurologically on the team. So it's a fine balancing act, and you guys really do have to become neurological specialists. Now, we do have a second option available to us, which didn't necessarily exist for us in the past, and that is you can build a resilient team. It's a two-way street. It's a partnership. Resilience is a crucial skill to be functionally employable in the 4IR environment. So every single staff member has a vested interest in themselves, us included, in becoming resilient. Because we don't, we're functionally unemployable in the future. It doesn't matter how skilled you are with your hard skills. If you don't have the soft skills of resilience, you are unemployable. If you snap, crackling, and popping and behaving from your reptilian brain, you are breaking down the efficacy of the team and the people around you. So we have a vested interest, but it's a partnership. It has to be built on an understanding. If people are relying too much on the company to manage the triggers, the ship is going to sink. If the company is relying too much on the people to be resilient, the ship is going to sink. It's a balance between that resilient and managing the triggers and the trust that is in actual fact building up in the team. So the principles of resilience are, it's not what happens to you, but how you respond to it that counts. We're watching the time. Okay, fantastic. Now, that comes from Epictetus. It was a slave 2,000 years ago. The idea of resilience is not something new. It's not something we've acquired here. There's been historically times when human beings had to endure incredible amounts of stress, and resilience is something that we are building on the shoulders of giants. It's not something we're just acquiring now. It's historically something that's existed through all these years. Enter the term biomastery. Biomastery is the contemporary term for meditation. The word meditation is problematic. We have to keep it because we live in a digital era. If you Google something like biomastery, which belongs to meditation for business, we developed this over the last 20 years. It's a verb. The Western world relates far better to the term biomastery, but the word meditation is what you have to Google when you want to have information on stress management. You have to Google meditation and stress management, and then you'll get all the data on biomastery. So just be careful in terms of throwing that word out, meditation. You do this at your own cost. Now, what biomastery means is being able to have mastery over one's biology, specifically the autonomic nervous system. Although this is an innate capability, and each one of you have had some form of biomastery, it's been reactive rather than proactive. People have to be taught biomastery. It's an acquired skill. Biomastery has a long history spanning several thousand years, but it was only in the last century that the West fully embraced it as a means of dealing with stress. The people who embraced it early was the military, Olympic and extreme sports athletes, politicians, business leaders, and right now, today, it's rapidly becoming the preferred method of stress management and resilience building by economists and political bodies because it is so cost effective, and by the people in general because obviously the internal locus of control is critical. If you're relying on something external to you, you are going to be vulnerable, especially in the 4IR environment. Now, neuroscience is rapidly identifying the underlying neurology of biomastery and why it works. The key component of biomastery is the thought process, being able to manage your thought processes. There's a lot more, but I'm going to talk about the thought processes now. 3 examples. Managing the thoughts the amygdala has access to, preventing the amygdala from accessing negative thoughts, and using thoughts to release chemicals that allow for high-level functioning. Let's start with the first one. What happens is that the executive prefrontal cortex, which represents the mammalian brain, it takes the thoughts with new external information and internal reasoning. It builds a constructive and positive worldview that challenges and changes the existing thought-emotion link. So what it does is next time the amygdala calls for information from the library, it sends the positive data. So when the amygdala gets it, it fails and stops, whether it's an internal thought or an external stimuli, to stimulate the hypothalamus and release your adrenaline. So simply by your thoughts, just by changing your thoughts, you can stop the stress response. Most of you experience that in some way or another. You've already done that. But they've shown it. They've done this in the lab. It's quite fascinating studies. Preventing the amygdala from having or accessing negative thoughts, this is a really interesting thing that has just happened in the last 2 years, is they've realized that you can actually block a negative emotion using a neurotransmitter called gamma-aminobutyric acid. It was GABA for short. And what they have found that people who are able to manage their thoughts have more GABA. Now, the very act, when you sit down and you think, I'm not going to have that negative thought, the boss has come out, they shouted at me, and I am now fearful that I'm going to lose my job. I'm not going to think that thought. The chemical way that you've allowed to block it is you've produced GABA. And what GABA does is a neurotransmitter that sits on the synapses, and it stops the impulse from actually crossing over and getting to the amygdala. And the final one is using those positive, using biomastery skills to shift from a cognitive thought-based intervention to an emotive feeling-based intervention. But as soon as you make that link, you release your positive executive hormones. Now, folks, listen to the level of biomastery that I'm talking about. When I said that we have to change as human beings, our skill sets, look at what we're talking about. You have to be able to sit here. How are we doing? We still okay for time? Running out. Okay, let's just go a little bit further, folks. I'm just going to tell you we've got dopamine, which is the anticipation of happiness. We have oxytocin, which allows us to be able to relate as groups. We've got endorphins, which make us mask pain. And we have serotonin. Now, folks, I'm going to end on this particular note here. These are all now, they used to be called happy hormones or happy chemicals. What they are their executive hormones and executive chemicals that in the next few years, you guys, through your thoughts alone, are going to have to induce within yourself through biomastery in order to survive where we're actually going in terms of stress levels. Now, we've developed a particular program of biomastery. For those of you that have got iPhones, you can scan the little scan me bars on the papers that you've got. For those, you're more than welcome to go to our website, Meditation for Business. We are specialists in those areas. Please don't hesitate to give us a call. I don't know if we've got time for questions.
We hardly have time for questions, but I'll kick one off.
Okay, here we go.
Just quickly, just 2 critical steps. You mentioned resilience, emotional intelligence, right? How can we get that to play? And self-awareness, self-regulation in the workspace. What can I do?
In the workspace. What I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly just run ahead over here, and I'm going to show you the different steps that we offer over here. Sensory attention, respiration, relaxation, concentration, contemplation, compassion, gratitude, digestion, and actionalization. I'm going to stop on one, just digestion. Let's see the new research that has come out. Within us, we have a whole series of bacteria that we rely on and outsourced huge amounts of functions. 60% of what we are as humans come from the genomes or the genes of the bacteria in your gut. They've taken rats, taken out these bacteria, and the rats can't function. For you to exist and be what you are, you need these bacteria. When you're stressed, you shut down digestion, you kill off these bacteria. But before they die off, they use the vagus nerve to send signals to your brain to say, start your digestion up again. And you experience that as anxiety and depression. So your stomach can generate anxiety and depression in the same way as your brain and your amygdala can create anxiety and depression. So right down, for example, being resilient is about just getting your digestion sorted out to show the power of these particular biomastery steps. Sorry it's been so having to leave some out.
But you're back here tomorrow?
Yes, back here tomorrow at 2 o'clock, and I'll make sure that these slides are not as many so we can get through and have time for questions. 2 o'clock the same time tomorrow.